All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight here at The Volume. Happy Monday, everybody. Hope all of you guys are having a great start to your week. Well, NBA free agency is here, and originally we were going to try to hit everything in kind of a free agency reaction today, but there is literally too much to get to. So we're going to split this into two parts. Today, we're primarily going to be focusing on Klay Thompson being traded as part of a sign-in trade to the Dallas Mavericks, what that means for both the Mavericks and the Golden State Warriors moving forward, and then Paul George signing a max deal with the Philadelphia 76ers, what that means for the Sixers coming into this next season, as well as the Los Angeles Clippers. Tomorrow in part two, we're going to get to Chris Paul to the Spurs, DeJounte Murray getting traded to the New Orleans Pelicans, and Isaiah Hartenstein to the Oklahoma City Thunder. All deals that are super, super interesting. We probably will also have another, two or three things to hit in tomorrow's show as well. So just focusing on the Warriors and the Mavericks and the Clippers and the Sixers in today's show. We'll get to the rest of the free agency moves in tomorrow's show. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss show announcements. Don't forget about our podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. And then keep dropping mailbag questions in the YouTube comments so we can keep hitting them throughout the rest of this summer. All right, let's talk some basketball. So when the first rumor started coming out that Klay Thompson was thinking about going to the Dallas Mavericks, I immediately hated it, to be honest. At first, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, Klay Thompson came in this like ball and player movement 5-out flow where he was getting all these reps coming off of screens. To give you an idea of how often Klay works with an off-ball screen, he took a shot off of an off-ball screen 430 times last year. 430. Second place was Steph at 280. So Klay did 150 more than Steph. And then there were 13 players who were between 100 and 199, but literally there was nobody in the stratosphere of Klay Thompson in terms of volume coming off of screens as a scorer. So like it's just a very different type of offensive approach to what Dallas uses, right? Like, to give you guys an idea, Dallas threw the second fewest passes per game in the NBA last year, and they were bottom 5 in assist percentage. This is not a ball and player movement team. So at first, I hated it. I didn't like it for Dallas. I didn't like it for Klay. It didn't make a ton of sense. I want to get but then the big thing that kind of like changed my perspective on it was when the news of the Najee Marshall signing came down. So the Mavericks get Najee Marshall, is this guard who played for the Pelicans, a guy I actually really like, a guy that has a ton of off-the-dribble pop. And then I look at the, compared to most role player guards, I should say. For a non-star, the guy can dribble and like kind of like shake and get to his spot and kind of just make something out of nothing offensively better than most role player guards can, right? And then I look at the math on the numbers, and Derrick Jones Jr. goes to the Clippers for 3 years, $30 million, so $10 million a year, and Najee Marshall goes to the Mavs for 3 years, $27, so $9 million a year, right? And so essentially what that means is that Dallas intentionally and purposefully chose Najee Marshall over Derrick Jones Jr. Now, Derrick Jones Jr. just had an amazing playoff run as a point-of-attack defender. He was probably the best veteran minimum value last year in the league, so much so that he turned himself into an 8-figure player, right? But he's a play finisher. He's a guy that can capitalize on advantages, but struggles to create or extend advantages. Najee Marshall is a guy that can create some advantages, but is a very good advantage extender, which is a concept we're going to get to here in a couple of minutes. So when I saw that, I started to think a little bit here. And now all of a sudden I'm looking at it as a complete change in philosophy from what happened last year for Dallas on the offensive end of the floor. Like, again, like when I look at what happened in the NBA Finals, it wasn't just a loss for Dallas. It was a loss in which their offense ceased to function. This was a team that was one of the best offenses in the league all season. And then when we got into the playoffs, they had many successful moments, including against that really, really good Minnesota Timberwolves defense. They had an offensive rating over 118. They could score. But Minnesota was running traditional coverages. They're putting their best perimeter defender on Luka. They were keeping their center on Dallas's centers. They ran, a high drop with some backside help. It was all pretty standard. And so the reads that Luka had in terms of the lob as Gafford or Lively would be rolling to the basket, or the skip pass to the weak side corner, all those things were pretty standard and normal. Boston didn't just shut down Dallas's offense. It completely ceased to function the way that it did in the regular season. They had just a 101.4 offensive rating in the 4 losses against Boston. All of a sudden, their lob game that they had in ball screens was not there. All of a sudden, just their basic spacing principles ended up with their worst above the break shooters above the break. And it all stemmed from a couple of basic game plan things from Boston. Boston put Jayson Tatum, their power forward, on Dallas's center, and just said, we're going to switch any ball screen with the center. Boom. Now the roll man possessions are gone. That's why you didn't see any lobs, right? So now that guy has to stand in the dunker spot. Now that the guy's standing in the dunker spot, there's just not as much space underneath the basket, as opposed to if he's rolling to the paint with a head of steam where he has vertical spacing capability, right? Now it's like we want to attack Horford. Well, Horford just switched onto Luka and did a pretty damn good job most of the series. Oh, well, Porzingis is out there. Let's attack Porzingis. Well, now Derrick Jones Jr. is popping above the break, and he's not a good above the break shooter. PJ Washington's popping above the break, and he's not a good above the break shooter. And so essentially the 4-out brute force ball screen spread attack just ceased to function. There were some other factors there, right? Like Kyrie and Luka both had tough pull-up jump shooting series. Like they took 122 pull-up jumpers between the two of them in the 5 games, and they got just 103 points. So like there were some other factors there, but the main thing is schematically their offense ceased to function. And again, like this is something that I talked about after that series. It wasn't close. Like they trailed by over 20 in 3 of the losses, and they trailed by 14 in the other. So it's like they got their butt kicked in the finals. And so one of the things, if you guys remember the show immediately after the finals, the next morning, I did an episode in which I talked about where Dallas needs to go from here. And I specifically said they need to find a way to incorporate more ball and player movement in their offense. They need to find a way to beef up the roster with ball handling and shooting and passing so that they can run more modern 5-out offensive concepts. That is where I suddenly came around on this deal. Now, I'm a little bit worried for Klay's benefit if the Mavs don't make these sorts of changes, because then he could end up in kind of a clunky offensive fit. And I saw a lot of Mavs fans go like, oh, this is an offense that generates a ton of catch and shoot threes. That's going to be great for Klay. And it's like, yeah, he's going to get some catch and shoot threes, but defensive game planning is going to be geared towards leaving PJ Washington open. It's going to be geared towards leaving everyone else open. They're going to stay glued up to Klay whenever they can. It's not like when Luka was driving in the finals, they were helping off of Kyrie Irving and leaving him wide open. No, they're good NBA defenses gear the ball to end up in the hands of your non-shooters. And so while Klay will dictate more attention, and certainly there will be better space than if you have 2 mediocre shooters on the floor, like if Derrick Jones and PJ Washington are on the floor, that's 2 bad above the break shooters. So having Klay out there will certainly help that situation. But make no mistake, like it's not like Klay's just going to be getting left wide open on the left wing all season long. Teams are going to try to gear their defense towards making sure that ball ends up in PJ Washington's hands for him to take jump shots, right? And so from that standpoint, like I'm hoping that this Najee Marshall piece and this Klay Thompson piece and maybe like a shift of Derek Lively permanently into the starting 5, I view that as a substantial increase in the aggregate ball handling, shooting, and passing ability of the roster and of the lineup, right? From there, that's where you open up the ability to have more 5-out concepts. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to run more 5-out concepts? All that means is that you don't have the big man sitting in the dunker spot, and you don't have like permanent corner 3-point shooters and you're running ball screens into open space. Instead, there is complete and total malleability in terms of ball and player placement on the floor. So for instance, let's say Derek Lively is at the top of the key and Luka has the ball. And let's say Kyrie Irving is in the right corner. Instead of just spacing the floor and running a ball screen, Luka might dribble into a dribble handoff with Kyrie. Then Kyrie might then come off of Derek Lively in a ball screen. He might draw in some nail help from Klay Thompson. He might swing the ball to Klay Thompson, who will then run another ball screen with Derek Lively, who comes over. Or maybe that's PJ Washington above the break, and you swing to PJ Washington, and he dribbles down and hands it to Klay. Then Klay comes off PJ Washington and off of Lively. Maybe the ball works its way back to Luka, but now Luka has the ball with 6 or 7 seconds on the shot clock, and there's been multiple reversals of the ball. Every player in a Mavericks jersey has touched the ball, and the defense is no longer loaded up on the strong side. When you're running just brute force 4-out ball screens, the defense is loaded up on you. Whereas when there's real ball and player movement side to side, now who knows how many switches they've had? The defense might have switched 1 or 2 of those actions. The weak side defense, which might have been loaded up in a first action in a possession, might still be glued up to their players on the other side of the floor as you're getting to that third action. The main point of contention here is when you play the truly elite defenses. And Minnesota, I think, should have been better than they did. They just focused on traditional coverages. But like when you face a truly elite defense that throws legitimate game plan wrenches into things, you can't just expect to crack the defense on the first approach. You've got to little by little crack the defense until it finally breaks on the final action. To kind of simplify it down to a 3-part process. It's advantage creation, advantage extending, and play finishing. In the past, Dallas has primarily been a advantage creation and play finishing team. They skip that middle step. There's not multiple attacks in the same possession. It's usually Luka makes a move, draws multiple defenders, and throws a kick-out pass or a lob pass. That guy might shoot or drive the closeout, but that's pretty much it. That's the extent of what you might have seen for the most part for Dallas. I'm not going to act like they didn't do anything. They ran some act. They run guard screens early in possessions to get switches for Luka. They'd run some stack pick and roll where they back screen for the roll man's man as he's trying to get downhill into the lane. They would run double drag to try to complicate the switches at the top of the ball screen. But there was very little in the way of actual side-to-side flow. And that's where advantage extending comes into the picture, right? Because if you're a play finisher and Luka is only able to generate for you a little bit of an advantage because it's a truly elite defense with an excellent game plan, that play finisher is going to struggle to finish that play, which is pretty much exactly what happened to the Mavericks in the finals, right? But when you have more ball handling and shooting on the floor, that's where you have the advantage, the ability to extend that advantage. So for instance, if that ends up being let's say a Klay Thompson, and he throws a really good pump fake because he's Klay freaking Thompson, and the dude goes flying by him, and then Klay, who his entire life has learned how to weaponize his shooting ability to generate dribble penetration and playmaking opportunities, drives that closeout and generates an even better opportunity on the weak side. And let's pretend that's PJ Washington or Najee Marshall, and that guy gets an even better opportunity. Like, that's where you extend the advantage with that side-to-side flow, which in my opinion is more resilient against something like what you might have seen against Boston. You can imagine a situation where if you actually ran 3 sides of action against Boston, now Tatum probably isn't on Lively anymore. He's probably been switched twice. By the time the ball gets back to Luka on the right side of the floor after multiple interchanges, at this point, the rim protector for Boston's probably in a weird place. Tatum's probably in a weird... There's probably a guard guarding Luka. Like, there's going to be something weird in Boston's configuration by virtue of you adding those complications. And by the way, I'm not just picking on Dallas here. This is something that was one of my major takeaways from this last season. I've watched multiple of these brute force 5-out teams, the Lakers 2 years ago when they lost in the conference finals, the Mavericks last year, where that it just seems to have a certain ceiling in terms of the adjustment. Like the Lakers, their most important point of attack defender was Jared Vanderbilt. They couldn't play him because he couldn't knock down corner threes. And in their offense, because they were running 4 out that year, Jared Vanderbilt was just parking his ass in the corner all game. And he couldn't do anything there. But then all of a sudden last year, in the 5-out offense for the Lakers, before Vanderbilt got hurt, he was successful in having all these double-figure scoring games because he was functioning as a dribble handoff and roll guy, right? When there's ball in player movement, it makes it so much harder to ignore a non-shooter. There's a resilience that you get from that type of ball and player movement. So one of the things that I said after that NBA Finals series was I wanted to see the Mavs try to take a shift in offensive approach and philosophy towards 5-out ball and player movement. And these signings, the Klay sign and trade and the Najee Marshall deal, they are both significant moves in that direction. One of the main reasons, too, why I want this, not just for the Mavericks, but for Klay, is there's a diminishing return on spot-up shooting. Klay Thompson is not just a shooter. He's a movement shooter. Like we talked about earlier, 430 reps last year. Second place was Steph, 280. There were only 13 players who ran over 100, and all those guys were under 200. It's kind of a unique thing he does. He shot 43% coming off of screens. Weighted for threes, 57%. He got 1.10 points per shot coming off of screens. He was a legitimate offensive threat in those situations. He's also a pretty solid playmaker in those situations. In his time in Golden State, he got good at hitting the pocket. Like he'd hit Trace Jackson Davis if his man showed on the handoff. He'd hit him slipping to the basket. He showed some ability to read the low man and make skip passes to the weak side corner. If you just have Klay take standstill above the break threes, you're diminishing what he brings to the table. For example, Klay shot 38% on guarded catch and shoot threes last year. He shot 40% on unguarded catch and shoot threes last year. It's not like there's not this idea that I think Klay's the second best shooter ever, right? It's not like Klay's going to shoot 75% on wide open threes. That's not how basketball works. What makes Klay the best shooter? There's a variance. Variance is baked into shooting. The best shooters in the world are in that 45 to 50% range, high volume, right? The very best in the world. All the really good ones are maybe in that 40 to 45 range. There's nobody out there that's just shooting 70% from three. So, for example, if you just had a professional standstill shooter out there who's not worth 17, 18 million a year, but a guy who's just a veteran minimum guy who can knock down, catch and shoot threes, he can approximate what Klay Thompson would do if he was standing on the wing in Dallas's offense. In order to really get the value out of what Klay Thompson brings in that contract, you need him to have the ball occasionally, not just occasionally, but consistently in the flow of the offense coming off of those screens. And so again, to be clear, I hate this deal if Dallas plays the same way they did last year. I think you'll get a diminished return on what Klay Thompson brings to the table. You obviously took a hit in terms of defensive personnel. You're going to run into the same issues when you get into a matchup in the NBA Finals, right, with Boston, if you were lucky to get there again. But I love this deal if it's an acknowledgement of the reality of what Dallas needs to do to become a more resilient playoff offense, which is if they use Klay Thompson with the ball in his hands as part of a 5-out flow going from side to side, if Najee Marshall is just another wave of that coming off the bench, if Derek Lively, who I think has the potential to be a really good 5-out fulcrum at the center position, then I love the deal. And so again, most of this just comes down to the type of basketball that Dallas wants to play next year. And I'll be really, really interested to see what their offense looks like as we get into the start of next season. Let's take a look at I just really quickly before we move on to the Warriors side of this. Let's just look at the Mavericks' top 7 players right now. Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, PJ Washington, who PJ showed a considerable amount of off the dribble pop in the playoff run. Derek Lively, Klay Thompson, Najee Marshall, Daniel Gafford. In that top 7, there's just so much more ball handling and shooting than they had last year. So I really like that deal in the context of that type of shift. Like even like Dante Exum is on a non-guaranteed deal right now. We'll see if they end up keeping him. But like, do you guys remember it happened in the finals where like the Mavs would have Dante Exum run like inverted ball screens with Luka, where Luka would set the screen, but Luka's man would not want to leave Luka, so he wouldn't hedge. So Dante would just get right downhill into the lane. He had a big dunk that way, if you guys remember. Like that's the advantage of having a player that can dribble next to Luka, because Luka brings that kind of attention to the table, right? And so like I really like that fit. You know, I like the idea of, again, when we include Najee Marshall off the bench, when we include Dante Exum off the bench, like there's just a lot of capability there to reach another level. Jaden Hardy as well. Like there's just a lot of capability within the context of the roster now to have a higher ceiling offensively. The biggest question is going to be, can they defend with this group? Because again, Derek Jones was very important to their defense last year. Now PJ Washington slides into that primary point of attack role instead of like a secondary point of attack role. Klay Thompson is probably going to have to guard a perimeter player with some skill, and he struggled in that area last year. So it's going to be a little bit of a test of their defense. But again, I'm a big believer in that you can coach up and scheme up a somewhat effective defense. But if they can reach another level offensively with this addition of offensive skill, it could be more than enough to make up for that gap. On the Warriors front, first of all, it's the end of an era. 6 conference titles, 4 NBA titles, bona fide top-tier contender in 7 of those 10 years. The other years were all kind of injury-related, right, with the exception of last year, which kind of felt like the first year of the decline. But it's just kind of sad to see the trio broken up. But it's just the reality of the second apron rules. I'm going to list these again when we talk Paul George, but to just give you guys a really quick breakdown. If you are in the second apron, you have no access to the mid-level exception, which means you cannot sign a player above the cap unless it's a veteran minimum contract. You cannot take on additional money in trades. You have to trade out more money. You cannot aggregate salaries in trades. So if you see a player that makes $20 million and you want to trade 2 $10 million players to get there, can't do it. You cannot use cash in trades to help kind of facilitate that the money balance. You cannot buy second-round draft picks. Remember when the Warriors bought that second-round draft pick for Jordan Bell? Can't do that anymore. You can't use trade exceptions to match salary. You can't use your own free agents and sign in trades. If you stay in the second apron multiple years, it affects your ability to use first-round picks in future trades. Like, it is incredibly punitive to be in that zone. And so I think the reality is the Warriors are just trying to get out of that second apron. Well, Lacob is trying to quickly relieve himself of the salary crunch that he was in last season, right? Now he quickly pivoted. They just signed DeAnthony Melton to the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, a contract that they would not have been able to sign unless they let Klay go. And I love DeAnthony Melton, for the record. I thought it was a really nice pickup, and we're going to talk about him in just a second. But make no mistake, this was a cost-saving move in general from Golden State. Not just the Klay Thompson piece, but letting waiving Chris Paul so that you didn't have to pay his $30 million salary next year. Right? So you lose all that salary, which helps you in terms of the tax, but obviously you lose the ability to use Chris Paul as a vehicle to bring in another player in a trade, and you lose Klay Thompson, who is an important kind of like structural piece of your team, right? Now, here's the deal with DeAnthony Melton. I think he is like the next best thing to KCP in terms of like, he's just a rock solid NBA starter, good athlete, good perimeter defender, can guard up and down a little bit. He's a good rebounder, can shoot and attack closeouts, just like a consummate professional, rock solid NBA starter. Like if you've got enough talent in terms of your stars, you're never going to be worried about what DeAnthony Melton is or isn't doing for your team, provided that he's healthy. Obviously, he was hurt much of last year. So within the context of helping Steph and accentuating him as a backcourt partner, love the DeAnthony Melton fit. But if they aren't willing or able to trade for a legitimate secondary shot creator, they're just still in a lot of trouble in this upcoming season. This team missed the playoffs last year in a field that allowed 10 teams in the Western Conference. So, like, I'm hoping that this is in the context of some sort of other move. I had heard through some reporting that the Warriors had an offer on the table from Chicago asking for Wiggins and Chris Paul for Zach LaVine, and the Warriors turned it down. Now, for obvious reasons, Lacob was trying to get out of that second apron, right? But, like, Zach LaVine is a guy that, even for all his flaws, that's why he's available for Chris Paul and Andrew Wiggins. You're not in the market for the more expensive stars, right? So, like, Zach LaVine could have at least been an option to provide some real shot creation and an influx of talent, and the Warriors just said, no, thank you. So I hope they have something else up their sleeves, because I think Steph's going to have a bounce-back year next year. It'd be a damn shame to ask him to grind through another rebuild, I shouldn't say another, but a rebuild, out of a sense of loyalty to the franchise when he has superstar years left in him. It's a waste. He's too good to be wasted on a rebuilding roster that can't contend in the Western Conference. And, like, Steph's not the kind of guy who would ask for a trade. So I really, really hope that Golden State and their decision makers, Joe Lacob and Mike Dunleavy, I hope that they snap out of it, and I hope they do something aggressive, because I really don't want to watch Steph Curry play meaningless basketball next year. And DeAnthony Melton's a good player and a really nice pickup, and they're going to have a certain amount of talent. But as good as Jonathan Kuminga can be, he's not there yet. As good as the other young players on that roster can be, they aren't there yet. This team does not have enough firepower, and I hope they have a plan to address that before we get to training camp. You know the beautiful thing about being a sports fan? There's only like 2 days the whole year without a game. 2. With so much happening and so much action, that makes just about every day game day at DraftKings Sportsbook. It's super easy for first-timers to get started. Try betting on something simple like picking a team to win. Go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app, select your team, and place your first bet. It really couldn't be any easier or any simpler. Baseball, golf, UFC, there's something for every fan of every sport to bet on DraftKings. And I know it's early, but football season will be here before you know it. And the Kansas City Chiefs are currently the favorite to win the Super Bowl on DraftKings at plus 550. And if you're new to DraftKings, you got to check this out. New customers bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code HOOPS. That's HOOPS. That's code HOOPS for new customers to get $150 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. All right, Paul George to the Sixers. It's an all-in type of move with the goal of giving Joel Embiid the firepower he needs to contend in the Eastern Conference, especially within some of the kind of pressure surrounding that situation after they've had a bunch of disappointing seasons in a row. So let's start with the good before we get into some of the other stuff. The basketball fit is seamless. Paul George was one of the most efficient shot creators in the NBA last year. During the regular season, he ran 517 pick and rolls that led to 580 points. It's 1.12 points per possession. Out of 60 players who ran at least 500 pick and rolls per synergy, including passes, he ranked 5th out of 60 in efficiency. So one of the best pick and roll players in the league. 341 points on 322 ISOs. That's 1.06 points per possession. That ranks 10th out of 19 players to run at least 300, so more middle of the pack there. But 137 points on 115 post-ups, including passes, 1.19 points per possession. That was 4th out of 48 players to run at least 100 post-ups last year. So really, really impactful regular season shot creator. Had a tough playoff run, which we'll get to in a minute, but like an immediate influx of shot creation ability, right? He's never played with the screen and roll man that has the type of gravity that Joel Embiid does. Especially when you consider most teams are not going to want to switch that action. Any player that's big enough to handle Joel Embiid will not be quick enough to handle Paul George and vice versa. So, like, I don't think you're going to see switching there. PG, if there's a weakness with him right now, it's that he can't really, like, beat people off the dribble the way he used to. Like, he only had 10 made field goals at the rim in that 6-game series against the Dallas Mavericks. So, like, you need him to have a good screener so that he can kind of methodically operate in the mid-range. I actually kind of like that as a change-up to Tyrese Maxey, too, because Tyrese Maxey is, like, all downhill speed and pull-up threes. Downhill speed, pull-up threes, right? And Maxey brings some movement shooting as well. So, like, I like Paul George as just kind of like a different kind of pace to attack with Joel Embiid. And then again, like when we look at what happened last year, it's like a lot of like minutes where it's like Maxey and Embiid with, you know, Batum, Oubre, and Harris, right? And like there just wasn't enough firepower offensively out of that threesome. And Tobias Harris was just had a really, really tough last couple of years there in Philly. And so like upgrading that to a legitimate threat like Paul George, I'm a big believer in like whatever you think about Paul George, like don't overthink things. Like this is a team that was giving the Knicks fits with that janky ass kind of fit with all those flawed wings, and then Maxey and Embiid, you just upgraded one of them into one of the top 25 players in the league. So like don't overthink it. Paul George is going to make things way easier for the Sixers, especially on the offensive end of the floor. Again, the main question mark is going to be how much resilience is there for him in the playoffs. Like, he had a rough series against Dallas. I'm not going to get into the details right now. We'll get into it when we talk the Clippers. But, like, the advantage is hopefully he's your third best player. You're hoping for Philly's sake that Maxey and Embiid kind of bring enough of that firepower that Paul George... Because here's the thing with Paul George. Paul George is a professional tough shot maker. It's one of the things that makes him so inconsistent. He takes and actively hunts really tough step back, pull up jump shots, right? And so as a result of that, he can go really cold some games and he can go really hot some games, right? You have the margin for error to deal with that on a team that already has Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. So even with some of the flaws that Paul George brings to the table, I'm like, don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Paul George makes the Sixers way better. Overnight, go on DraftKings. They're now the second favorite to win the title behind the Boston Celtics. A distant second favorite, but they're still, of all the teams you can bet on to win the title, the only team that has better odds is the Boston Celtics. So, like, that is the advantage of bringing in the firepower that Paul George brings to the situation. One other concern would be age. Like, if the Sixers make it to a second-round series next year, Paul George will be 35 years old at the time that series tips off in the first year of his 4-year deal. So, like, obviously there's going to be some risk in the long run with that deal, but you know, at the end of the day, you had to do something to give firepower to Joel Embiid. Paul George really was the best option available to them in free agency, and they got him. So it's hard to refer to it as anything other than a win. Moving forward, presumably you're going to get Kelly Oubre at the 4, right? You need to find an athletic 2 guard who can guard at the point of attack. That's going to be the interesting piece for them to try to track down here in the coming days. A lot of veteran minimum contracts are going to be in the running here. That's the one thing that gets tough when you have 3 max level players. You got to fill out the roster with veteran minimums, and there are flaws that come with that. And so we'll see. The difficult job is going to be for Daryl Morey here to try to find value in that market. Who's the next Derrick Jones Jr. this year? Who's the next guy that someone can find at a relatively discounted rate to anchor the point of attack defense role? And that's where Philly's going to have an advantage, because it's like, hey, veteran minimum, but we're the team that has the second best odds to win the title. That's going to help you in some of those conversations, right? They're just going to need health. None of this matters if Joel Embiid can't be Joel Embiid. He has to be the best player in the world for this team to get where it wants to go. Make no mistake, the addition of Paul George and Tyrese Maxey does not give the Sixers a substantial talent advantage over Boston. Boston just signed Derek White today for a deal over $30 million a year. They have 5 players that make over $30 million per year. They are still more talented than the Philadelphia 76ers right now. And the only thing that can rectify that situation is Joel Embiid. He has to play like the best player in the world. He has to outplay Tatum, unlike Tatum outplaying Embiid like he did in Game 7 2 years ago. Embiid has to win those battles in order for this team to get where they want to go. This is where I like another signing that the Sixers had earlier this summer, or 2 days ago. They get Andre Drummond. Now, this is a really, really nice move, because not only is it a backup center option, but if you need to hold Embiid to 50 games, if you need to try to keep his game total down to no more than 3 times a week, or whatever it is that you need to do, hold him out of every back-to-back, hold him out of a random road trip here or there that's a quick road trip, like whatever it is you need to do to withstand Joel Embiid's rest schedule, that's where Andre Drummond comes in as a legitimate starting caliber center that can help in those situations. So again, like, Paul George has his warts. That's why the Clippers let him go. It's obviously not the best possible player that you could conceive of to fit alongside Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, but he's who was available. He was the best option. Overnight made the Sixers the second favorite on DraftKings to win the title. Don't overthink it. The Sixers are going to be fun to watch next year. Moving on to the Clippers. Again, just the reality of the second apron rules. For the sake of the people that might see this in a breakout clip, I'm going to list the kind of ramifications of being in that second apron. No access to the mid-level exceptions. You cannot sign players for anything other than the veteran minimum contract. You can't take on additional money in trades. It used to be you could go over a certain percentage. You can't do that now. Can't aggregate salaries in trades. You can't partner two $10 million contracts to trade for a $20 million guy. Can't use cash in trades to make up for a gap. Can't buy second-round draft picks. A lot of second-round draft picks, you just throw $2 or $3 million, get a second-round pick. Can't do that anymore in the second apron. Can't use trade exceptions. Can't use your own free agents in sign-in trades. There are all these restrictions that come from being in that second apron, and it's just clear that Steve Ballmer doesn't want to operate like that. And again, it's a profoundly restrictive zone to be in, and there's pretty much one team that you see that's in that situation where it kind of makes some sense, and that's the Boston Celtics. They signed Derek White to this 4-year, $126 million deal, but it's they don't really have to need to improve the roster over the summer, right? Boston's got their 5. As long as those 5 guys as long as 4 of those 5 guys are healthy, they're still the best team in the league. So they don't need to go. Everything for Boston is a luxury. The Clippers situation is totally different. Now, they had a dominant stretch this year. They had a stretch where they looked better than the Celtics. From November 17th to February 5th, the Clippers were 31-8. That was the best record in the league over that span by a wide margin. They had a 5% better win percentage than the Celtics did over that span. And that's almost half a season. They were first in offense. They were 11th in defense. They were kicking everybody's butt. So the counterpoint of view here would be, we were a bona fide top-tier championship contender, and our superstar got hurt. Why don't we run it back and see if we have better luck, right? And that would be the case for retaining Paul George and going into the second apron. But here's the more realistic point of view. That same superstar who was unable to go this year has been unable to go 4 consecutive postseasons. He's either been completely hurt and missed it entirely, or 3 times he made it into the playoffs. Twice he made it into the playoffs healthy, played, looked great, then got hurt. Another time came into the playoffs hurt, tried to play, ended up staying hurt, right? It's 4 years in a row. In addition to that, Paul George looked pretty underwhelming in the Mavs series. He shot just 14 for 43 on pull-up jumpers. He shot below 50% on layups. He made just 10 shots at the rim in total over a 6-game series. He was their highest usage rate player. He had a higher usage rates than James Harden out of any Clipper starter, and he didn't even average 20 points a game in that series. So when they needed him to step up and play like a superstar, he did not reach that level. And so while it's hard to stomach as a Clippers fan losing a player like Paul George and effectively losing your championship ceiling, Paul George is going to be 35 years old in the playoffs last year. We just talked about how much he struggled. Kawhi Leonard has all of these issues. It looked like a small likelihood that everyone would stay healthy again. So the Clippers are looking at the situation and they're saying, we're going to have to tweak the roster. We're going to have to make moves. We're going to have to aggregate salaries. We're going to have to do all of these things to try to field a competitive roster going into the future. The only way they'll have that flexibility is if they let Paul George go. And so they had to. So the question is, where do the Clippers go from here? Re-signing James Harden was really smart. He's still one of the best regular season offensive engines in the league. Whatever you think about him in the playoffs, he's still a very good regular season offensive engine. Even if Kawhi misses time again, he can help the Clippers as they go into this new arena. He can help the Clippers still field a respectable basketball team in that new arena. And most importantly, he's still a very tradable contract. $35 million a year, only 2 years. No one's taking on some sort of long-term commitment. It's not like you can trade 2 mid-level salaries to make that fit, right? if the Clips decide to pivot to a full rebuild halfway through next season or next summer, James Harden will fetch a couple of picks or a couple of good young players. So that you had to pick one of them. I think James Harden will have more trade value. So in terms of asset management, keeping Harden at 2 years for 35 was a better deal than signing Paul George to 4 years, 200. You'd have much harder contract to trade, right? This maintains their flexibility. The Derrick Jones Jr. fit makes a ton of sense. In the short term, he's an excellent point of attack defender, demonstrated that in the postseason last year. He's a solid closeout attacker. He's a good play finisher. Play finishers play well alongside James Harden because James Harden spoon feeds you those opportunities, right? And like in this particular situation as well, he is another tradable asset. He has an achievable low salary. He is a position that everyone's looking for. Everyone wants a guy who can guard the other team's best player. That's something Derrick Jones can do. And so, like, look, if Kawhi is healthy next year and plays like an MVP, they're going to be a respectable team fighting in the middle of the Western Conference. I don't think they have a championship ceiling, but they'll be fighting. If Kawhi gets hurt and they decide they want to pivot to rebuild, you just signed 2 really good trade assets that you can turn around and flip to try to spark that rebuild process, right? So like I liked it for the Clippers. It's not a fun move, but it's a demonstration of self-awareness and a first step towards the next phase of this franchise with some flexibility in different directions they can go. They can go soft rebuild, they can go hard rebuild. They have some flexibility now that would not have existed had they re-signed Paul George. So I like the move. All right, guys, that's all I have for today. As I said, we're going to get into the rest of the free agency stuff tomorrow. As always, I sincerely appreciate you guys for supporting the show. We will see you guys then.